There is a moment right before a man dies when everything becomes perfectly, terrifyingly clear. The lies he believed, the people he trusted, the life he thought he was building. All of it collapses into a single, brutal truth. He trusted them with his life, and they used that trust to end it. But they made one mistake. They didn't check his chest. And that mistake would cost them everything. If you think a man left to die deserves revenge, hit like and subscribe. Because what the Mafia boss is about to discover will change everything. Introduction. To understand what happened in that alley, you have to understand the world that made it possible. Not the world most people see, not the office buildings, the restaurants, the lit-up streets of a city that looks clean from a distance. The other world, the one that runs underneath it. Every major city in the world has a second government, one that operates without elections, without courts, without the inconvenience of public scrutiny. It has its own laws, its own economy, its own military, its own justice system, if you can call it that. And at the center of this second government, in this particular city, sat an organization known only as the Syndicate. They didn't have a flashy name. They didn't need one. In the underworld, names attract attention, and the Syndicate had spent decades perfecting the art of invisibility. They moved money through legitimate businesses, construction, logistics, import-export. They owned politicians the way other people owned furniture, useful, replaceable, and never allowed to speak unless spoken to. They had enforcers, strategists, accountants, and spies. They had judges in their pocket and police chiefs at their dinner tables. They had a hierarchy so rigid, so precise, that moving up through its ranks was both the dream and the damnation of every man who entered it. And men did enter it. Young men, mostly. Men with nowhere else to go. Men who had grown up watching the world reward cruelty and punish kindness, who had decided early on that if the game was fixed, they would rather play on the winning side. Marco Voss was one of those men. If you had met Marco 5 years before the night in the alley, you might have mistaken him for something entirely different. There was an earnestness to him that didn't belong in the world he'd chosen, a directness in his eyes, a steadiness in his hands that suggested a man who believed in something. Not God, necessarily. Not country, but something. A code, maybe. A private, personal understanding of right and wrong that he carried the way other men carried weapons. Quietly, always present, drawn only when necessary. He had joined the Syndicate at 22. Not because he wanted power, not because he craved money. Because they had found him at the exact moment his world had collapsed. When his father was dead, his family was in debt, and the only two options in front of him were slow starvation or fast compromise. He chose compromise. And he was very, very good at it. Over 5 years, Marco Voss had become one of the Syndicate's most trusted field operatives. That's a sterile way of saying he was a man who solved problems that couldn't be solved through conversation. He gathered intelligence. He moved assets. He protected people who needed protecting, and when the order came down, he made people disappear. He was not a killer by nature, but he had learned to be one by necessity. And through all of it, every dark assignment, every sleepless night, every moment of moral compromise, he had told himself the same thing. I am building towards something. This is temporary. When I have enough, when the family is safe, when the debts are clear, I will get out. It's the oldest lie in the underworld. And Marco, brilliant as he was, believed it completely. For 5 years, he gave the Syndicate everything. His time, his skill, his sleep, his conscience. He completed missions that other operatives refused. He solved problems that senior lieutenants couldn't crack. He was loyal genuinely, completely loyal in a world where loyalty is the currency everyone claims to have and no one actually possesses. He thought that loyalty would protect him. He was wrong. Because here is what Marco Voss did not know. as he walked into what he believed was a routine assignment on a rain-soaked Tuesday night. The Syndicate had decided he needed to die. Not because he had failed them, not because he had betrayed them, but because of something he carried without knowing it. Something stitched into the very fabric of who he was. A secret older than the Syndicate itself. A bloodline they had tried to erase 20 years ago. And thought they had. They were about to discover, in the most costly way imaginable, that some things cannot be erased. This is the story of the night Marco Voss was left to die in an alley. And what happened when the most dangerous man in the city came to finish the job. The last assignment. The call came at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. Marco was in his apartment, a deliberately unremarkable place in the middle of the city. 3 rooms, no photographs on the walls, no evidence of a life beyond utility. The kind of apartment that told you exactly what you needed to know about the man who lived there. He had learned not to get attached to things. The phone rang once. That was the code. 1 ring meant the call was official, coming through the Syndicate's internal relay system. 2 rings meant personal. 3 rings meant emergency. 1 ring meant, "Come in, we have work." Marco didn't hesitate. He put down the glass of water he'd been holding, pulled on his jacket, checked the inside pocket out of habit, the gesture automatic, like breathing, and left. He arrived at the secure location 20 minutes later, a nondescript office building in the financial district, its upper floors leased to one of the Syndicate's shell companies. The kind of building that looked perfectly ordinary in daylight and perfectly empty at night, which was exactly the point. He was met in the lobby by a man named Carver. Now Carver is important. Remember Carver. He was the Syndicate's head of internal operations, the man responsible for coordinating field assignments, managing communication between divisions, and ensuring that the Syndicate's left hand never quite knew what its right hand was doing. He was methodical, efficient, and profoundly unreadable. He had the kind of face that gave away nothing, not warmth, not coldness, not even the carefully constructed neutrality that most people mistake for professionalism. Just nothing. A blank wall with eyes. He had never particularly liked Marco. Marco had never particularly cared. "You're being assigned to the North Harbor tonight," Carver said. No greeting, no preamble. "There's a package that needs to be retrieved from a contact. Standard extraction protocol. You go in, you collect, you return. Simple." Marco looked at him. Something, a small, quiet thing, the kind of instinct that can't be explained logically, but that field operatives learn to pay attention to, flickered at the back of his mind. "Who's the contact?" he asked. "You'll be briefed on site." "I'd prefer to be briefed now." Carver's expression didn't change. "You'll be briefed on site," he repeated. "The package is time-sensitive. You should move." There it was again, that flicker. In 5 years with the Syndicate, Marco had never walked into an assignment without knowing the basics. Who, what, where, why. It was standard protocol. It was, in fact, a rule that Carver himself had established early in Marco's career, back when he still occasionally pretended to care about field operative safety. Tonight, Carver was breaking his own rule. And he didn't even blink doing it. Marco noted it, filed it, said nothing. Because in the Syndicate, asking too many questions was itself a flag, a signal that you were either scared, untrustworthy, or worst of all, thinking for yourself. Any of those things could get you moved from the trusted list to the watched list, and Marco had worked too hard, given up too much to risk that. So he nodded, took the address, and went. The drive to North Harbor took 35 minutes through rain that had graduated from heavy to torrential. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and the city outside the windows dissolved into a blur of lights and reflections, red and white and yellow smearing against the black wet streets like a painting left in the rain. Marco drove without music. He always did on assignment nights. He used the silence to think. The assignment, as Carver had described it, was simple enough on its surface. North Harbor was one of the Syndicate's operational zones, a stretch of warehouses and industrial buildings along the waterfront that served as a transit point for the organization's logistics operations. Marco had been there before. He knew the layout, but the on-site briefing bothered him. Not enough to turn back, but enough to sharpen his attention, to bring him to the heightened state of awareness that the best field operatives wear like a second skin, that readiness that lives just below the surface of normal functioning, waiting to be needed. He parked 3 blocks from the address. Habit. He walked the 3 blocks with his collar up and his hands loose at his sides, scanning the environment automatically, parked cars, building entrances, windows with lights on, windows without. The street was mostly empty at this hour in this part of the city. That was normal for North Harbor at night. What was not normal was the absence of the usual Syndicate security presence. North Harbor, as an operational zone, always had at least 2 lookouts posted during active assignments, young men on corners with earpieces, and the carefully cultivated expression of people trying to look like they aren't doing anything. It was basic protocol. Tonight, nothing. The building at the address was a mid-sized warehouse, gray concrete, rusted loading doors, a single light burning above a side entrance. Marco approached carefully, scanning, processing, every instinct now fully awake and reporting data that didn't quite add up to a comfortable picture. He reached the side entrance, tried the handle. It opened. Inside, darkness, broken by the thin beam of a work light mounted on a post 30 feet in. The smell of salt water and industrial oil and something else, something copper metallic that Marco's subconscious identified before his conscious mind caught up. Blood. He stepped inside, let his eyes adjust, moved toward the light, and found the contact. Or rather, what was left of him. The man was dead. Had been dead for at least an hour, Marco estimated, based on the cooling of the body and the state of the blood that had pooled beneath him on the concrete floor. He was a mid-level Syndicate courier, someone Marco had seen before, exchanged nods within corridors, never spoken to at length. He had the look of a man who had been taken by surprise, which was telling, because couriers with any experience were not easy to surprise. But he was very thoroughly dead. And the package he had supposedly been carrying, whatever it was nowhere to be seen. Marco straightened, turned slowly, fully alert now, the quiet alarm inside him no longer quiet. He had been sent to a dead drop that was already dead, which meant one of 3 things. Either the operation had gone wrong before he arrived, or the operation had never been real, or... He didn't finish the thought. 4 men entered from the far end of the warehouse, Syndicate operatives. He recognized 2 of them, moving with the coordinated precision of men who knew exactly where they were going and what they were there to do. They were there to do Marco Voss. He moved, not toward them, toward the side, away from the light, into the shadows near the loading bay, buying himself 3 seconds of confusion while they adjusted to his movement. In those 3 seconds he assessed. 4 men, armed, trained, prepared. The exit behind him was the way he'd come in, but 2 of them were already cutting toward it. He wasn't going to make it to that door. He made it to the loading bay instead, a heavy steel door that took both hands and a second he nearly didn't have, bursting through it into the roaring rain outside. He ran. What followed was not the elegant, choreographed escape of an action film. It was brutal, ugly, desperate. Marco ran through rain-slicked alleyways, through gaps between buildings, over fences and through puddles that swallowed his ankles. He was fast. He had always been fast, and he knew this part of the city reasonably well, which gave him an advantage. But they were close, and they had radios. He heard the crackle of communication behind him even through the rain, the clipped, efficient language of operatives coordinating a pursuit, cutting off routes, positioning themselves for an intercept. They knew this area better than he did. 3 minutes into the chase, he turned a corner and ran directly into the second team. 2 men point blank, no time. The first one swung, and Marco ducked under it and drove his elbow into the man's ribs, a sharp, precise strike that knocked him back but didn't drop him. The second man was better, faster, with the kind of practical fighting experience that comes from years of violence, not training. He caught Marco across the face with an open hand strike that turned his vision white for a half second, long enough. Long enough for the first man to recover. Long enough for the others to arrive. Marco fought. With everything he had, with 5 years of training and 10 years of survival instinct, he fought. He hurt 2 of them badly enough that they would remember it for weeks. He nearly broke through twice. But there were 6 of them by the end. And one of him. He went down on the 4th strike to his midsection, a kick that drove the air out of his body with a completeness that made his legs forget what they were for. He hit the ground. They hit him twice more, efficiently, and then stepped back. He lay in the alley, face against wet concrete, rain pouring down on him. And he understood in that moment, with the absolute clarity that comes only at the very bottom of everything, that he was going to die here. Not because he had failed the Syndicate. Because the Syndicate had decided he needed to die. Tell no one you were given a chance. Marco Voss lay in the alley and waited for his lungs to decide whether they were still working. They were barely. He was bleeding from somewhere on his head, somewhere on his side. His vision was doing something complicated and unreliable. The rain was very cold. He thought about his mother. He hadn't thought about her in a long time. He did not lose consciousness. He wanted the darkness that would have been, if not merciful, at least quiet. But consciousness held on with the same stubborn insistence that had characterized his entire life, refusing to let go. He lay in the alley. The rain fell. And somewhere in the distance, too distant at first to be threatening, growing slowly, undeniably closer, were footsteps. Not running, not searching. Walking. The walk of a man who already knows exactly where he's going and has no reason to hurry, because nothing at his destination is going anywhere. Marco couldn't lift his head, but he could hear. And something in the rhythm of those footsteps, slow, measured, absolutely certain, told him, with the precision of a death sentence, exactly what they meant. They had sent someone to finish it. The footsteps stopped. Close, very close. A long silence. And then a sound Marco did not expect. Not the sound of a weapon being prepared. Not the sound of a man who has come to do a job. A sharp intake of breath. The sound of surprise. From a man who, Marco would soon learn, was never surprised by anything. The man with no mercy. Before we return to the alley, and we will return in a moment, because what happens next will change everything, you need to understand who just walked in. Because the man who found Marco Voss dying in that rain-soaked alley was not a lieutenant, was not an enforcer, was not any of the various ranks of dangerous men that the Syndicate employed. He was something else entirely. His name was Dominic Cross. And if the Syndicate was a shadow government, Dominic Cross was its shadow king. There are different kinds of power in the underworld. There is the loud kind, the kind that announces itself through violence and spectacle, that wants to be feared and goes to considerable lengths to make sure that it is. This is the most common kind, and also the most fragile, because it depends entirely on other people's willingness to keep being afraid. And then there is the other kind. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind that walks into a room and changes the temperature without saying a word. Dominic Cross was 43 years old. He had run the eastern operations of the Syndicate for 11 years, which in the underworld was something like saying a man had survived 11 years at the edge of a cliff in high winds, theoretically possible, practically improbable, and a testament to something beyond ordinary competence. He was not physically imposing in the way that the word mafia boss tends to suggest. He was not particularly tall, not barrel-chested, not loud. He dressed well, expensively, but without ostentation, the kind of clothing that says, "I don't need to try," rather than "look how hard I tried." He moved without waste, spoke without excess, and had eyes that people found difficult to look at directly, not because they were frightening exactly, but because of what they did. They saw everything, cataloged everything, and gave back nothing. He had grown up in the underworld. His father had been in it, and his father's father. He had been educated in its logic from boyhood, had absorbed its rules and rhythms the way other children absorbed language, effortlessly, completely, in the way that things learned young become part of the architecture of a person. He was, by any reasonable measure, brilliant. He was also, by any reasonable measure, ruthless. But here is the thing about Dominic Cross that most people in the underworld understood but few could articulate. His ruthlessness was never personal. He did not enjoy violence. He did not take pleasure in fear. He simply recognized with complete clarity that the world he operated in ran on certain mechanics: supply and demand, leverage and consequence, loyalty and betrayal, and he applied those mechanics with the same dispassionate precision that a surgeon applies a scalpel. He had ordered deaths, many of them, each one calculated, justified within the cold logic of his world, executed cleanly and without dramatic flourish. He did not lose sleep over them, but he also did not celebrate them. He had one rule, one that was known throughout the underworld and respected even by his enemies. He never killed without reason. Not without sufficient reason. Not without understanding, completely and with certainty, why the killing was necessary. It was not mercy, it was precision. A man who kills without reason creates chaos, and chaos is the enemy of operations. Every death had to serve a purpose. Every purpose had to be earned. It was this rule, this specific calculating standard, that had brought him to the alley tonight. The call had come to him through his own intelligence network, separate from the Syndicate's official channels, as most of his real information was. There was a cleanup operation happening in North Harbor. A field operative was being removed. The order had come from the Syndicate's Leadership Council. Under normal circumstances, Dominic Cross would not have been involved. Internal personnel matters at that level were handled below him, and he had long since stopped attending to the details of every operation that didn't directly concern him. But the name of the operative being removed had given him pause. Marco Vaz. Not because he knew Marco personally. He didn't, not beyond the operational reports he'd seen. A field operative with an exceptional record, loyal, capable, currently assigned to Eastern logistics operations. No. What gave him pause was something else. Something in his own private intelligence archive. A file that very few people knew existed, that he had been building quietly for years, that linked the name Voss to a piece of history the Syndicate had buried so deeply it might as well have been mythology. He had driven to North Harbor himself. Not because he intended to save anyone. That was not, at this stage, his purpose. He drove there because he needed to see, with his own eyes, if what he suspected was true. And if it was, well, that would change things considerably. He had found the alley without difficulty. His people had tracked the cleanup team's movements, and the aftermath of an unauthorized removal in an operational zone left traces that his network was designed to detect. He had arrived perhaps 10 minutes after the Syndicate's team had left. He had found Marco exactly as he was left, face down, bleeding, breathing shallowly, alive by the narrowest possible margin. And he had crouched down. And he had looked. Because that was the sound we heard at the end of the last chapter, wasn't it? That sound of surprise. From a man who was never surprised. He had reached down and carefully, with the practiced gentleness of someone handling something fragile and irreplaceable, pulled aside the collar of Marco's rain-soaked jacket and exposed the mark on his chest. It was not large, slightly larger than a coin perhaps, positioned over the sternum, the breastbone, the center of the chest, placed there, clearly with deliberate intention, in a location that would be concealed by clothing but close to the heart. A crest, old design, the kind of iconography that belongs to the pre-modern era, before organizations had logos and brands and had to compete for recognition in crowded markets. This was something older, simpler, more serious. A circle within which two lines crossed at a particular angle, not the common cross of religion, but something more asymmetrical, more intentional. Around the outer edge of the circle, almost too small to read without knowing what you were looking at, a series of marks that were not quite letters and not quite symbols but occupied the space between. Dominic Cross stared at it. In 11 years of running Eastern operations, he had seen this crest twice before. Once in a file that should not have existed, a document from the Syndicate's prehistory, from the period before the current leadership had consolidated power, when the organization had been younger and more fragmented, and in its way, more honest about what it was. And once on a dead man. A man who had been killed, specifically, intentionally, completely, 20 years ago, along with every other person bearing any connection to the bloodline this crest represented. Or so the Syndicate had believed. Dominic Cross stood up slowly, looked at Marco Voss, beaten, bleeding, rain-soaked, closer to death than to anything else. Looked at the crest, looked at Marco again, and made a decision. Not an impulsive one. There was nothing impulsive about Dominic Cross. It was a decision arrived at through approximately 30 seconds of rapid, comprehensive calculation, weighing what he knew, what he suspected, what this information could mean, what it could be worth, what the risks were, what the opportunities were. The calculation resolved in Marco's favor. Not out of compassion, though Dominic Cross was not, despite appearances, entirely without it. Out of intelligence. Out of the clear-eyed recognition that this man, this dying man with the Forbidden Crest on his chest, was not a liability. He was a weapon. And weapons of this particular kind did not come along often. He pulled out his phone, called a number, when it was answered. "I need a medical team at the North Harbor location. Quiet, private now, tell no one else." He crouched back down beside Marco. And Marco, through blurred vision, through pain that had colonized every nerve in his body, through the fog of blood loss and shock, managed to turn his head slightly and look up. He couldn't see clearly. He could make out a figure, a face, unreadable, dark eyes. "Who?" he started. "Don't speak," the figure said, not unkindly, not warmly, just simply the way someone states a practical fact. "Are you?" Marco tried again, because he had to know, because the only thing keeping him conscious was needing to know one thing: are you here to finish it? A silence, during which Dominic Cross looked at him, at this broken, bloody, stubborn man asking the most important question he'd ever asked in his life, and felt something that he would not have called respect, exactly, but that occupied the same general territory. "No," Dominic said. "Then what?" "I'm here because of what's on your chest." Marco blinked, tried to process this, failed. What do you know about?" "More than you do, which means we have a great deal to discuss, when you're able." "Who are you?" Marco managed. Dominic Cross looked at him for a long moment. "Someone who just decided not to let you die," he said. "For now, that's enough." The Forbidden Crest. Marco woke up in a room that was not a hospital. He knew this immediately, before he'd fully surfaced from unconsciousness, because hospitals have a particular quality of silence. A silence full of mechanical sounds, beeping and ventilation, and the soft-soled shoes of nurses. And this room had a different quality entirely. This silence was old. The silence of walls that had kept many secrets. He woke slowly, in stages, consciousness returning the way light returns at dawn, gradually, not all at once. He became aware of warmth first, then the absence of rain on his face, then the ceiling white plaster, ornate in a way that belonged to a building at least a century old, a style of architecture that had gone out of fashion long before anyone currently alive had decided anything. He was in a bed, a real one, clean sheets. He had 3 cracked ribs, he would learn later, a concussion, a laceration above his left eye that had been closed with 10 stitches, various contusions, the technical, clinical word for the kind of bruising that makes a doctor wince and a patient move carefully for weeks. He was alive. Alive in a room he didn't recognize, in a building he didn't know, at the courtesy of a man he'd met while dying. He lay still and took inventory of his body, of the room, of his situation. It was what he had always done in uncertain circumstances: assess before acting, understand before speaking. 5 years of field work had made it reflex. Room, medium-sized, well-furnished old building. 1 window, shutters closed, but the sound of the city present beyond them. 1 door slightly ajar. No visible security, which didn't mean there wasn't any. His jacket was gone. His phone was gone. He was wearing clothes he didn't recognize, clean, dark, practical. And his chest. The crest was still there. Of course it was still there. It wasn't removable. It had been there his entire life, a mark he'd been born with, or more precisely, a mark that had been placed on him at birth by hands he had never known, for reasons that had never been explained to him. His mother had always deflected questions about it. "It's a birthmark," she'd said, which was technically not untrue in the sense that he had been born with it, but which Marco had always known was an evasion rather than an explanation. And he had stopped asking, eventually, because she would go pale and quiet when he did, and he loved her too much to keep putting that expression on her face. He had learned to live with the mystery of it, had assumed, eventually, that it was exactly what she said it was, an unusual birthmark, slightly symmetrical by coincidence, the kind of thing that attracted occasional curious looks in locker rooms and medical offices, and meant nothing beyond its own strange aesthetics. Apparently, it meant considerably more than that. Dominic Cross walked in. Daytime, or at least the soft gray light that filtered through the shutters, made him different from the shadowed figure Marco had barely been able to see in the alley. More defined, more real, more, in a paradoxical way, comprehensible. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on the table beside the bed and sat down in the chair across from it. Not close, not far, the precise distance of a man who had calculated the geometry of this conversation in advance and positioned himself accordingly. He looked at Marco with those cataloging eyes. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Terrible," Marco said. His voice came out rougher than expected. "Where am I?" "Safe, that's sufficient for now." "It's not, actually." "No," Dominic conceded. "I suppose it isn't. You're in a building I own, in a part of the city that the Syndicate doesn't operate in. My medical staff has treated your injuries. You've been unconscious for approximately 18 hours. 18. You needed it." Marco pushed himself to a seated position, which cost him considerably more than he would have preferred. He reached for the coffee. His hands were steadier than they had any right to be. "You're Dominic Cross," he said, not a question. A slight tilt of the head. "You know me. Everyone in the Eastern operations knows your name. Not everyone has met you." "And now you have," Dominic said, "under unusual circumstances." "You said it was because of the mark on my chest." "Yes. What do you know about it? Dominic didn't answer immediately. He picked up his own coffee, drank, replaced the cup with the unhurried precision of someone who had long since made peace with the fact that most things could wait. What do you know about it? He asked. Marco looked at him. Nothing. That's not entirely true, is it? I know it's not a birthmark, Marco said. I've known that since I was old enough to look at it properly. The symmetry is too precise. The detail is too intentional. Someone put it there. When you were 3 days old, Dominic said. Silence. Marco stared at him. What? The crest was placed on you 3 days after your birth. The process is traditional. It goes back considerably further than the organization that currently finds it threatening. It was applied by the last surviving member of a family called the Vossen. Vossen, Marco repeated. My family's name is Voss. Shortened, Dominic said, deliberately. A safety measure. Tell me what you know about your father. Marco felt something tighten in his chest, not the ribs, something else. He died when I was 17. Accident, my mother said. A warehouse fire. It wasn't an accident. The words landed in the room like stones dropped in still water, the impact immediate, the ripples beginning. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that your father was Marcus Vossen, that the Vossen family was, for a period of approximately 40 years, before the current leadership consolidated the Syndicate into its present form, one of the founding houses of the organization, that the crest on your chest is the mark of that house, and that 20 years ago, the current Syndicate leadership made a decision. He paused. They decided the Vossen bloodline was a liability. Because the founding covenant of the Syndicate contained a provision, an old provision from the original charter when the organization was built on something resembling principles. The provision stated that in the event of a leadership crisis, a significant enough failure of the governing council, control of the organization could revert to the founding bloodlines. The current leadership spent 10 years carefully dismantling that provision, changing the charter, rewriting the history, making sure that the families who could have invoked it were either bought, absorbed, or removed. The Vossen family was removed. My father, Marco said. His voice was even, remarkable, my entire family. Your father, 2 uncles, your paternal grandmother, several cousins, all removed over a period of 3 years through methods ranging from direct violence to arranged accidents to manufactured criminal charges. Your mother survived because she was not a Vossen by blood. Your existence was not known to the Syndicate. Your father had hidden both of you very carefully. When he died, you were 17 and already building the kind of anonymous life that made you difficult to trace. Until I walked into their organization, Marco said. Until you walked into their organization, Dominic agreed. With your father's name abbreviated but present, working so effectively, rising so consistently that eventually someone began to look at you more carefully, to trace the name backward, and found the Vossen connection. Dominic confirmed, which is why 2 weeks ago the Leadership Council authorized your removal. Marco was quiet for a long moment. The coffee in his hands was getting cold. He didn't notice. He was processing, and the processing was visible in the precise way his eyes were moving, not looking at anything in the room but working through something internal, assembling pieces, finding the shape of something that had been shapeless his entire life. His father's death, his mother's deflections, the mark on his chest that she would never explain. 5 years given to an organization that had murdered his family. 5 years of loyalty to the people who had killed everyone he'd come from. Why did you save me? Dominic Cross looked at him. This time, the calculation in his eyes was accompanied by something else, something that might, in a different man, have been respect. Because the Syndicate's Leadership Council has been making decisions for years that I find problematic, he said carefully. Decisions that are bad for the organization, bad for operations, and that represent a level of paranoid overreach that has, over time, made them more of a liability than an asset. And because the provision in the founding covenant, the one they spent so much effort erasing, was never, in fact, fully erased. He reached into his jacket, placed on the table between them a photograph. Old, the kind of photograph that belonged to a film camera in an era before digital made images cheap and disposable. Two men standing together in what appeared to be a formal setting, both in dark suits, one of them young with sharp eyes and a direct gaze. "My father," Dominic said, pointing to the younger man, "and yours." "They were partners," Dominic said, "before everything, before the Syndicate became what it is now, when the organization was built on a different set of principles. My father told me before he died that if the Vossen bloodline ever resurfaced, I was to protect it." "Not out of sentiment," Dominic added, with the precision of a man who never wants to be mistaken for sentimental. "Out of strategy. The provision can still be invoked. The founding covenant still exists, a copy, authenticated, in a location the current leadership doesn't know about. If the last surviving Vossen heir can invoke it publicly before the right witnesses, it doesn't destroy the Syndicate," Marco said slowly, understanding arriving. "It restructures it, replaces the leadership council with a governance structure that was designed to prevent exactly the kind of consolidated, unchecked power that the current leadership has spent 20 years building," Dominic finished. "You want to use me?" Marco said, not angry, just clear. "Yes," Dominic said. No apology, no softening, just the simple honesty of a man who had decided that this particular person deserved the truth. "And you think I should want to help you?" "I think," Dominic said, "that you should want to do what you would have wanted to do 5 years ago if you had known everything you know now. I think you should want the people who killed your father to answer for it. I think you should want the organization you gave 5 years of your life to on false terms, under a false identity, without knowing what it had done to your family, to be held accountable. I think you have very powerful reasons to be angry," Dominic said quietly, "and I am offering you a way to do something useful with that anger." Marco looked at the photograph of the two men, his father and Dominic's father, young, standing together in a world that no longer existed. Then he looked at the man in front of him. "Tell me everything," he said. Wolves in the same house. The next 72 hours were unlike anything in Marco Voss's experience. He had spent 5 years in the underworld. He had operated in dangerous situations, had navigated the treacherous social geography of an organization built on mutual suspicion and shifting alliances. He thought he understood how the world he'd chosen worked. He had understood approximately half of it. Dominic Cross's world, the inner world, the world beneath the world he showed even to his own lieutenants, was something considerably more complex. They worked in the building's upper library, a room that suited Dominic in a way Marco would come to recognize as characteristic. Everything in it was functional, but nothing was merely functional. The books on the shelves were actually read. The maps on the tables were actually used. There was a clarity of purpose to the space that communicated without a word being said that this was a room where actual thinking happened. Not performance, not signaling, thinking. They went through it all. The history first. The Syndicate's founding, the original coalition of 5 families, including the Vossen, who had come together in the city's chaotic post-war period to establish order in the informal economy. The covenant they had written together, a document that was part contract, part constitution, establishing governance structures, conflict resolution processes, succession protocols. The Vossen family's particular role within that structure, not the most powerful, not the wealthiest, but the most legally sophisticated, the ones who had drafted much of the covenant's language, who understood better than the others what they were creating and had tried to build in safeguards. The provision is in Article 7, Dominic explained, spreading a document on the table. It states that in the event of what the founders called catastrophic governance failure, defined as the systematic abuse of organizational power against members, families, or bloodlines within the covenant, any recognized heir of a founding family may invoke Article 7. And what does invoking it do? It triggers a restructuring process. Mandatory. The Leadership Council is suspended pending review by a council of elders, representatives from each founding family, or their designated successors. Marco looked at the document, and the other founding families. Are there still heirs? 2 that I know of. One is currently in prison on charges that were, in my informed opinion, manufactured. The other is living abroad under a different name and is not aware of their lineage, which is, of course, not coincidental. The Syndicate's leadership systematically removed or isolated every person who could threaten their authority through the covenant. Over a period of 20 years, yes. Dominic's voice carried something beneath its usual measured quality, not anger exactly, but the kind of cold judgment that sits beyond anger on the other side of it. It was patient work, methodical. I will give them that. And you've been watching it, Marco said, building the case. I've been waiting for the right moment, Dominic said, and for the right person. The Article 7 invocation requires not just the heir's presence and claim, but corroborating evidence of governance failure. What happened to your family is that evidence. Your existence, authenticated, witnessed, documented, is the claim. But first, Marco said, we need to not be dead. First, Dominic agreed, we need to not be dead. Because here was the problem. The Syndicate believed Marco Voss was dead. Their cleanup team had left him dying in an alley and had reported mission accomplished. At some point, and Dominic estimated that point was approximately 48 to 72 hours out, they would conduct verification. Standard protocol for high-risk removals. Confirm the body, confirm no evidence. When verification found no body, they would know the mission had not been accomplished. And they would begin looking. They'll look for me, Marco said. Yes. And they'll look for whoever interfered. Dominic met his eyes. Yes. You understand what you've done, Marco said. It was not quite a question. I've introduced a significant operational risk into my own position, Dominic said evenly. Yes, I'm aware. That's an interesting choice for a man who spent 11 years being very careful. It is, Dominic agreed. Something moved briefly in his eyes, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, self-aware and a little dry. But careful men sometimes calculate that a risk is worth taking. What developed over those 72 hours was not friendship. Let's be precise about that. Marco and Dominic were not compatible in the way that produces friendship. They were too similar in some ways, too different in others, and both too shaped by the underworld to have the kind of easy warmth that friendship requires. What developed was something harder and more durable than friendship. A working alliance between two highly capable people who understood, with complete clarity, what they needed from each other and what they were each willing to risk. Marco spent those 3 days recovering his physical strength, faster than his injuries technically warranted, because he had always healed quickly, another characteristic that had occasionally prompted comments from medical staff, and simultaneously absorbing everything Dominic laid before him. The organizational chart of the current Syndicate leadership, their names, their positions, their histories, the architecture of the governance failure that Article 7 was designed to address, the location of the authenticated copy of the founding covenant, the names of the witnesses who would need to be present for an invocation, and the opposition. Because the Syndicate's leadership was not going to accept an Article 7 invocation gracefully, they had spent 20 years preventing this exact scenario. They had the resources of the most powerful criminal organization in the city at their disposal. They had lawyers, politicians, police, and their own considerable private army. When they discovered that Marco was alive and who he was, and they would discover it, because their intelligence network was extensive, and this was too significant to hide for long, their response would be swift and total. The window for action was narrow. "We have 3 phases," Dominic said on the second evening, standing in front of a map he'd drawn on the wall. "Phase 1. Establish your identity. We need authentication of the Vossen lineage, DNA documentation, the original birth records that your mother likely still has, witnesses from the old days who knew your father and can testify to the bloodline. Phase 2. Locate the other heirs. The provision is stronger, harder to challenge, harder to suppress, with multiple founding families represented. Even one additional heir makes the invocation significantly more powerful." "And Phase 3, Marco asked. "Phase 3 is the invocation itself, public, before the right witnesses, before the Leadership Council can prevent it or discredit it. This is the dangerous phase. As opposed to the first 2 phases, which I assume are entirely safe," Marco said. "Phase 1 carries intelligence risks. Phase 2 is operationally complex. Phase 3 is where everything is at stake." "There's something you haven't told me," Marco said. Dominic looked at him. "Carver," Marco said. "He set up the assignment. He's the one who sent me to that warehouse." "Yes." "Is he working directly with the Leadership Council, or is he?" "Carver is not simply a messenger," Dominic said. "He is one of the principal architects of the Leadership Council's internal security apparatus. He has been systematically identifying and removing threats, real and perceived, to their authority for the past 8 years. He's the one who identified you," Dominic continued, "when the Vossen connection became apparent. It was Carver who brought it to the Council, and it was Carver who designed the removal operation." Something shifted in Marco's expression. Not rage, something colder than rage. "He's been in the organization the entire time I've been there," Marco said, "working near me." "Yes." "Doing his job," Dominic said precisely. "He serves the Leadership Council. You were a problem. He solved it. The fact that he is efficient doesn't make him less of an enemy." "And more personally," Dominic continued, "Carver was involved in the operation that killed your father. He was younger then, a junior operative, but he was present. He is one of the witnesses who can testify under Article 7 to the governance failure, whether voluntarily or otherwise." Marco looked at him. "You've been building this case for a long time," he said. "I have." "And you've been waiting for the Vossen heir." "Yes." "You knew my father," Marco said. "Not a question this time." "Briefly, I was very young when he was killed. My father spoke of him. He said Marcus Vossen was the most principled man in a world that hated principles. He said the Syndicate was worse for losing him." "He was right," Dominic added simply. Marco looked at him for a long time. "All right," Marco said finally, 3 phases. Where do we start?" And in that room, with the city quiet outside and the map on the wall between them, 2 men who should, by any ordinary calculation, have been enemies. One cold and brilliant, and carrying 20 years of patient strategy. One wounded and newly knowing and carrying 20 years of buried truth, began building the thing that would bring the Syndicate to its knees. But before they could execute a single phase, they didn't wait for verification, Dominic said. "The Leadership Council has called an emergency session. They know you're alive." Which meant they had approximately 12 hours less than they'd planned for. The ghost walks back. 12 hours. In another kind of story, 12 hours might feel like enough. In another kind of story, the heroes would use those 12 hours to execute a flawless plan, arrive perfectly positioned, and deliver justice with cinematic precision. This is not that kind of story. In 12 hours, Dominic and Marco needed to achieve what had been planned for several days. The first phase, establishing Marco's identity, documenting the Vasan lineage, required resources, people, and movement across a city that was, as of approximately 6 hours ago, actively looking for both of them. Because the Syndicate's emergency session had not been merely administrative. Within 2 hours of the session's beginning, Dominic's intelligence network reported the following: an active search for Marco Vas, declared alive and in breach of organizational security. A separate, quieter inquiry into Dominic Cross's recent activities, which had not yet reached the level of open accusation but was clearly preparing to. And a lockdown of the Syndicate's key operational locations, the archives, the secure communications network, the financial hubs, designed to prevent exactly the kind of access that Phase 2 of their plan required. Dominic moved with the efficiency of a man who had prepared for contingencies in the way that excellent chess players prepare for unexpected moves, not by predicting every possibility, but by maintaining a flexible position from which multiple responses are viable. He had people, not many, a deliberately small circle, because in this business circles expanded into vulnerabilities, but the right people, positioned carefully over years, trusted in the specific and limited ways that trust survives in the underworld. There was Sierra. If Dominic Cross's world had a second in command, Sierra occupied that position, though the title would have made her laugh. She was not a lieutenant in any traditional sense. She was, in the plainest terms, a fixer. A woman who had grown up in the Syndicate's outer circles, had learned its mechanisms with the intimate knowledge of someone raised inside a machine, and who had at some point made a private decision that the machine needed to be either improved or broken down. She was 40 years old, spoke 4 languages, and had a talent for logistics that bordered on supernatural. She could move people, money, and information through a city on lockdown in the way that water moves through rock, not by breaking it, but by finding every crack. Marco met her in the back room of a restaurant in the old district, one of Dominic's properties, though nothing about it advertised that fact. She looked at him with eyes that assessed and moved on quickly, not from disinterest, but from efficiency. She had already seen what she needed to see. "You look better than I expected," she said, "given the report." "What report?" "The one that says you're dead. It circulated through the Syndicate's internal network this morning. Clean removal, mission accomplished, very thorough, until someone noticed the body wasn't in any of the expected disposal locations." She placed a folder on the table. "Birth records," Sierra said. "Your mother had them in a location that took my people approximately 4 hours to find. She was, I'm told, not surprised to receive visitors asking about them." Marco looked up. She knew. "She knew," Sierra confirmed. "She's known your father's real history for 30 years. She chose to protect you from it. She also chose, when my people explained the situation, to help. She's safe. She's been moved. She understands the necessity. She asked me to tell you she's sorry she kept it from you." "There's more," Sierra said. "Blood work, samples your mother preserved, with a corroborating sample from our own authenticated Vasan archive. DNA documentation is, fortunately, more complete than the Syndicate realized when they tried to erase the lineage records." And then she placed the last document in the folder before him. It was a letter, handwritten, dated from 21 years ago, the year before his father's death. He recognized the handwriting before he read the greeting, though he had never seen it as an adult. Some things are carried in the body, in the shape of a hand, in the angle of letters, in the pressure of a pen on paper. He recognized it the way you recognize the voice of someone you haven't spoken to in years, immediately, completely, without question. "To whoever reads this after me, if you are reading this, then the precautions I have taken were not enough, and the Syndicate has done what I feared. I write this not to mourn that fact, but to prepare for what comes after. I have a son. His name, the name I gave him, the only thing I could safely give him, is Marco. He carries the Vossen mark. He does not know what it means. I have made this choice deliberately. A child who does not know a secret cannot betray it. When he is old enough to understand, when the time is right and the world is different, someone who I hope will still be watching will find him and tell him. He will be angry. Let him be angry. The anger is earned. But after the anger, I hope, he will understand that what I was trying to protect is worth protecting still. The covenant is not just a document. It was a promise that power, when we gathered it, would be held accountable. That no single family, no single council would use it to destroy the others. We built something in the beginning that was almost good, almost honorable by the standards of what we were. If Marco is reading this, I am sorry. I am sorry I could not be there. I am sorry for the weight I have put on you without your knowledge or consent. But you are a Vossen, and a Vossen carries what they are given. The covenant still exists. Find the copy in the Eastern Archive. Find Dominic Cross, he will be watching if he is his father's child, and invoke Article 7. It has never been done, but it can be done. Make them answer for what they built. Marcus Vossen. Sierra watched him, said nothing, knew, with the instinct of someone who has sat with people in hard moments, that nothing needed to be said. Eventually, Marco folded the letter carefully, put it in his pocket. He knew, Marco said. He knew Dominic would find me. He knew there was a chance, Sierra said. He made sure there would be something to find. Where is the Eastern Archive? Marco asked. The Eastern Archive, one of the Syndicate's most closely guarded repositories, housing financial records, operational histories, covenant documentation, and a library of compromising material accumulated over decades, was located inside a converted building in the warehouse district on the opposite side of the city from where they currently were. It was not unguarded. Under normal circumstances, accessing it would have been a multi-day operation requiring careful preparation, cover identities, and several layers of infiltration. They had approximately 10 hours. Dominic laid out the approach with the kind of calm that only comes from having spent a career walking into dangerous buildings and coming back out. The archive has 3 security layers, he said. External, physical security, 2 men on each access point, rotating shifts. Internal, electronic, motion-sensitive, connected to the Syndicate security network. And the archive itself locked, with an access system that requires authenticated credentials. I have the credentials. Marco looked at him. How? I helped design the security system 8 years ago, Dominic said simply. At the time, I was being thorough. I was also, as it happens, being prepared. You've been planning this for 8 years. I've been preparing for multiple contingencies for 8 years, Dominic corrected, precisely. This particular contingency required your existence and your willingness. I did not design the plan around your cooperation. I designed it around the possibility of your cooperation. The distinction matters to you. The distinction is accurate, Dominic said, which is why it matters. The plan for the Eastern Archive involved 3 moving parts. Sierra's people would create a distraction on the building's perimeter, nothing violent. Nothing that would trigger a weapons response, but sufficient to redirect external security's attention for the 8 minutes that Dominic and Marco would need. Dominic would use his credentials to bypass the electronic layer, accessing the archive through a maintenance corridor that the security system he designed had, deliberately, a slightly slower response time in. Marco, who knew the Syndicate's operational layout from 5 years inside it, would navigate from the maintenance corridor to the archive's restricted section and retrieve one document, the authenticated copy of the founding covenant, with the Article 7 provision intact. What are the odds this works? Marco asked. Dominic considered, moderate. That's not a number. I know. 60%, 50, 30. High enough to attempt, Dominic said. low enough to plan for failure. The plan for failure is, we run, we regroup, we find another route to the invocation. It won't be as clean, it won't be as fast, but it won't be finished. You're willing to run, Marco said, after 11 years of building this position. Dominic looked at him steadily. I'm willing to do what the situation requires. That has always been my approach. They moved at 2 a.m. What followed was not comfortable. It was careful and fast and full of the specific tension that lives in the space between preparation and execution. That place where everything you've planned meets the irreducible reality of a world that doesn't care about your plan. Sierra's distraction worked. A false alarm at the building's loading dock, a sophisticated piece of misdirection involving a vehicle and a series of signals that mimicked a Syndicate emergency protocol, pulled 3 of the 4 external security personnel to the east side of the building. Dominic moved with Marco through the maintenance corridor, his credentials clearing the electronic layer with 4 seconds to spare before the system's secondary check would have triggered an alert. The archive's restricted section was cold, temperature-controlled for document preservation, and lit with the particular blue-white of institutional fluorescence. Metal shelves, row upon row of files, organized with the obsessive precision of people who understood that information was power and treated it accordingly. Dominic went directly to the right shelf. He knew the system had, at one point in the past, quietly ensured that certain documents were filed in locations he could find again. The Covenant was in a sealed container, acid-free, protective, old. He lifted it, opened the seal, confirmed the contents, closed it. We need to go, Marco said quietly. They went. They made it out with 90 seconds to spare before the Syndicate security network registered the credential use and flagged it. 90 seconds. Dominic held the Covenant container. Marco looked at him. Phase 1, Dominic said quietly, done. Now comes the part where we find out if this city still has a conscience. The Second Heir. They drove through the early morning, that particular hour when the city belongs to the workers arriving and the night dwellers retreating, when the streets exist in a kind of temporal seam between one day and the next. Marco didn't sleep. He hadn't slept really since the alley. He sat in the passenger seat with the founding Covenant container on his lap and thought about his father. Marcus Vossen, who had built a careful, invisible life to protect his family, who had written a letter 21 years ago and placed it in a location he trusted would survive him, who had, in the act of being erased from the world, managed to leave enough trace to be found by the right person at the right time, who had apparently known, with a father's specific, desperate certainty, that his son would be capable of this, of sitting in a car at 5 in the morning, with cracked ribs and a recently closed head wound, holding a document that could restructure the most powerful criminal organization in the city, and not flinching. Marco thought about how it felt to be trusted like that by someone you'd never had the chance to know. Heavy and clarifying. Tell me about the Second Heir, he said. His name is currently David Park, Dominic said. He was born David Brennan. The Brennan family was another of the 5 founding houses. His parents moved abroad when he was 4 years old. He was told by parents who, unlike your mother, chose simply not to tell him nothing about his lineage. Where is he now? Barcelona. He runs a small architecture firm. He is, by all accounts, a thoroughly normal person living a thoroughly normal life. He's not going to want to hear this, Marco said. No, Dominic agreed. He probably isn't. And we need him. We don't strictly need him. The invocation can technically be made by a single heir, but with 2 founding family heirs, the Covenant provision is significantly harder to challenge. It creates a joint claim, which the founding document specifies cannot be overridden by a simple majority of the Leadership Council. It's the difference between a challenge they might manage to suppress and one they definitely can't, Marco said. Essentially, getting to David Park, to David Brennan, was phase 2, and it was, in some ways, the most delicate part of what they were trying to do. Not because it was the most dangerous, but because it required something that neither Marco nor Dominic was particularly practiced in. Convincing a stranger to upend his life based on truths he'd never been told, in service of a cause he'd never been asked to consider, against enemies he didn't know he had. The conversation was Sierra's suggestion. She had already, through her international contacts, established a communication line. Not with David directly, but with someone who knew him well enough to make an introduction that wouldn't seem threatening. Dominic placed the call on a secure line at 6 a.m. Barcelona time. Marco listened. The intermediary was a woman named Sofia, a former Syndicate associate who had, years ago, made a clean exit through a combination of leverage and geography, and who owed Dominic Cross a debt that she had been waiting for 15 years to repay. She lived in Barcelona now. She knew David Park. She had watched him, at Dominic's quiet request, for several years, not invasively, but enough to understand who he was and what kind of man he had become. The conversation was careful. Dominic spoke for 20 minutes, explaining the situation in terms measured for someone receiving extraordinary information from an unexpected source. Sophia was quiet throughout. When he finished, she was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I'll bring him to you. Give me 48 hours. 48 hours. Which they might or might not have. Because while they had been retrieving the Covenant and preparing the David Park approach, the Syndicate had not been idle. They've moved to the next level, Sierra said. The credential use at the archive was traced. They know Dominic accessed it. They've activated the full internal security apparatus, active searches, not just passive monitoring. They've named you as a compromised asset, she said to Dominic. The language is official. You're no longer a trusted member of the Eastern operation. You're a target. That's faster than I anticipated, Dominic said. Not alarmed, just nodding it. Carver is driving it, Sierra said. He's coordinating the response personally. He knows or suspects that you have the Covenant copy. He also issued a specific order regarding Marco. He knows you're alive, she said, and he knows now about the Vossen connection. The order he issued is a termination order. His exact words were permanent and complete. No retrieval. No interrogation. He's scared, Marco said. He's practical, Dominic corrected. Scared and practical often look the same. A living Vossen heir with the founding covenant is the one thing the Leadership Council cannot manage through ordinary means. They can't buy it off. They can't negotiate it away. The covenant is legally, within the Syndicate's own founding law, binding. So they need us to not be alive, Marco said. They need the covenant not to reach its destination, Dominic said, which amounts to the same thing. We don't have 48 hours, Marco said. No, Dominic agreed, we probably don't. He thought visibly, and Marco noted this, because it was the first time he'd seen Dominic think in a way that was visible, the inner machinery briefly showing through the composed exterior. We move the invocation up, Dominic said. We can't wait for David Park to arrive in person, but his presence isn't necessarily required physically. The covenant specifies that the invocation can be made before witnesses, and that corroborating heirs can submit their claim through authenticated documents. What does that mean practically? Marco asked. It means we need a notarized statement from David Park, acknowledging his lineage and formally joining the Article 7 claim. Can Sophia get that from him in the next 12 hours? If she can convince him to participate at all, Sierra said. Get her on the line, I'll make the case. The next several hours were a study in the particular tension of preparation under pressure, the feeling of building something substantial under a deadline that doesn't care how substantial it is. Sierra coordinated logistics. Dominic worked on the documentary package. The Covenant, Marco's authenticated identity, the evidence of governance failure, all of it assembled into a form that could be presented before witnesses in the formal invocation. Marco spent 2 hours with a lawyer that Dominic trusted, the kind of lawyer who had spent a career operating in the spaces between formal legality and practical reality, understanding how both systems worked and how they occasionally, under unusual circumstances, intersected. The lawyer walked him through the invocation process, what it required, what it would produce, what would happen immediately after. It was not a comfortable picture. The invocation was not a magic solution. It would trigger a governance process within the Syndicate, legitimate, binding, but still controlled by the organization's internal mechanisms. The Leadership Council would be suspended pending review, but the review itself would be conducted by the Elders' Council, whose composition was partly drawn from figures who had long-standing relationships with the current leadership. "It's not a guarantee," the lawyer said carefully. "It's a disruption," Marco said. "Yes, a significant one. It creates a crisis of legitimacy that forces the organization to reckon with its own founding principles. It limits the Leadership Council's authority in the immediate term. It creates legal space for the imprisoned heir, if he can be identified and released, and for the governance failure evidence to be formally examined. And the people who tried to kill my family. That depends on what the Elders' Council decides to do with the evidence." It was not the clean revenge narrative that part of him, the part that had spent the last 2 days learning what had been done to people he came from, wanted it to be. There was no moment in which justice arrived perfectly and completely, in which the guilty faced unmistakable consequences, and the world rearranged itself into proper order. This was not that story. This was a first move. A disruption. A crack in a wall that had been built over 20 years. And what mattered was whether the crack was real. "Is it enough?" Dominic asked when Marco returned from the lawyer. Marco looked at him. "Is a crack in a wall enough to eventually bring it down?" "Depends on the crack," Dominic said. "This one goes to the foundation," Marco said. "Yes, it's enough." "It's Sophia," Sierra said. She listened for a moment. Something changed in her expression. She held the phone out to Dominic. Dominic took it, listened. A long pause. When he lowered the phone, there was something different in him. Something that Marco, who had spent enough time watching this man to have learned his subtle registers, recognized as unexpected. "David Park received Sophia's call," Dominic said. "And?" "He said he'd been waiting for it." "He knew," Marco said. "It appears that unlike your mother's choice to say nothing, his parents, while they moved him away from the city, away from the Syndicate's reach, did leave him something. A letter, similar in nature to your father's, explaining his lineage, telling him that if contact ever came, it should be trusted. He's been living a normal life," Dominic continued. "But he's known for 20 years that one day the normal life might be interrupted. Is he willing? He's already preparing his statement. He says, and Sophia finds this amusing, that he has a very good architect's instinct for when a building's foundation is unsound." Then Sierra's other phone sounded. Different tone, emergency. Her face changed. "Carver's team," she said quietly. "They found this location. We have approximately 20 minutes before they arrive." The first betrayal revealed. 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, the most dangerous response team the Syndicate had, Carver's personal unit, 11 men with the kind of operational experience that comes from years of internal enforcement, would arrive at the location. They were not coming to negotiate. Sierra moved first. She had always operated best under pressure, with the paradoxical effect that constraint focused her in a way that open space didn't. She was already coordinating the evacuation of the building's secondary materials, backup documentation, communication equipment, the pieces of infrastructure that would be needed for what came next. Dominic moved second, with the Covenant container and the assembled documentary package, placing them in a locked case that was, itself, placed in a secondary bag that could be carried in a way that didn't announce its significance. Marco moved third, which he had learned in the past 3 days was not passivity. It was his read of what was needed and wasn't yet being provided. He went systematically through the space they were leaving, identifying and removing everything that could be used to trace their next location or deduce their plans. They left with 8 minutes to spare. The separation was Dominic's design, standard operational security, in which the most critical cargo moved in one vehicle, while other vehicles created movement and noise in the Syndicate's detection network. Marco was in a nondescript sedan with Dominic, and a driver Dominic trusted with the kind of specific, well-tested trust that he extended to very few people. "Where are we going?" Marco asked. "The invocation location," Dominic said. "We don't have time to stage it properly, but we never did. The staging was always going to be a compromise. The question now is whether we can get there before Carver's people work out where we're headed." "Do they know about the invocation plan?" Marco asked. "They know about the Covenant. They know about your identity. Whether they've understood how the pieces connect, Carver is intelligent. He will have connected them. Which means he knows where we're going. Which means we need to be faster. The invocation location, the place where, under Article 7, the claim had to be formally made, was specified in the Covenant itself. Not a specific building, but a category. A location within the organization's founding territory, in the presence of at least 3 witnesses from outside the Leadership Council, with documentary evidence and authenticated identity. Dominic had identified a location months ago in preparation for exactly this contingency, a building in the original district where the Syndicate had been founded in the era of its creation. Old, still within the legal organizational territory, still barely viable. A building that had been, before everything else, the original meeting place of the 5 founding families. It was 2 miles away. 2 miles through a city that was now actively engaged in finding them. "That's not police," Marco said immediately, as a vehicle blocked an intersection ahead. "No, Syndicate vehicle, Eastern Division markings." "Don't stop," Dominic said. "Take the secondary route." 3 more minutes of driving, then the building ahead. The original meeting house was a 4-story structure in the old district, stone-faced, heavy, the kind of building that had been built with the intention of lasting, that communicated permanence in every line of its architecture. It had been used for decades as a private social club, the kind with no advertising and no public presence. Its membership consisting entirely of people with reasons to value discretion. Dominic had the access. They went in. The main hall was on the 2nd floor, a room that had been many things over its century of existence, but that retained beneath its current configuration the bones of its original purpose. A table, chairs, the kind of space designed for consequential meetings. 3 witnesses were already present, people Dominic had positioned days ago, waiting for exactly this moment. A retired judge, the kind whose retirement hadn't diminished his standing in the legal community. A former Syndicate elder who had resigned from the organization 12 years ago on principle, and whose credibility within the underworld was, paradoxically, enhanced by the resignation. And a journalist, the careful, methodical kind, the kind who verified before publishing and who had spent 15 years building a reputation for accuracy in the coverage of institutional corruption. They stood as Dominic and Marco entered. "We're ready," Dominic asked. "We're ready," the judge said. "Are you?" Dominic placed the locked case on the table, opened it, laid out the documentary package in the precise order that the invocation required. The Covenant, the identity documentation, the governance failure evidence. David Park's notarized statement, which had arrived digitally from Barcelona 40 minutes ago and been printed and notarized locally through one of Sierra's contacts. He looked at Marco. "Before we begin," Marco said, "I need to say something." Everyone in the room looked at him. "I was 22 years old when I joined the Syndicate," he said. "I joined it because I had nothing. Because the world I grew up in had taken everything it could take, and I made a choice to stop being taken from. I gave that organization 5 years. I believed I was building towards something better. I believed that loyalty meant something." He looked at the Covenant. "What I know now is that the organization I was loyal to murdered my father, murdered my family, murdered the people who built the structure that everyone inside it, including the people who ordered those murders, were supposed to be accountable to." His voice didn't rise, it stayed level, which made it more powerful, not less. "This isn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. This is accounting. This is the document working the way it was designed to work, for exactly the reason it was designed to work." He looked at Dominic. "His father," Marco said, "and my father built something that was supposed to matter. And then other people decided it only mattered when it was convenient for them. I'm here to make it matter again." "Then let's proceed," the judge said. "The invocation of Article 7 of the founding covenant of the Syndicate, the first time in the organization's history that the provision had ever been formally activated, took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of formal language, documented and witnessed, the words of a 70-year-old document being read aloud in a room that remembered the people who had written them. Marco Voss, last surviving heir of the Vossen founding family, presented his authenticated claim. David Brennan, heir of the Brennan founding family, joined through his notarized statement. The governance failure evidence was formally submitted. The witnesses signed. And in the underworld's own legal architecture, the structure that the current Syndicate leadership had spent 20 years carefully subverting, something shifted. Something that couldn't be unshifted. Then from outside, vehicles, multiple fast doors. Carver's team had arrived. The reckoning begins. They had 4 minutes. Not 4 minutes to escape. Escape, at this point, was a secondary concern. The invocation was complete. The documents were signed and witnessed. The journalist had already transmitted a digital copy of the core documentation to a secure external server, which was standard practice for exactly this kind of situation. The kind where the evidence needs to survive even if the people carrying it don't. The 4 minutes mattered for a different reason. Carver's team was coming in through the front entrance. But the original meeting house, as Dominic had noted when he'd chosen it months ago, had been built by people who understood that important meetings sometimes needed quiet exits. There were 3 other exits. The judge and the journalist moved through the east corridor toward the building's back entrance. Sierra had people waiting there with transport. The Syndicate elder moved toward the basement passage. Dominic and Marco stayed. "You don't have to," Marco said. "I know," Dominic said. "They'll take you." "Probably." "Why?" Dominic looked at him steadily. "Because someone needs to be in the room when they arrive. Someone who can look at Carver directly and tell him what's already happened, what's already been done. Someone he can't simply make disappear without consequences." "You have the crest," Dominic said. "You have the bloodline. The invocation is complete, but what follows from it will take time, and during that time people will try to undo it, challenge it, suppress it. The invocation needs to be known publicly, broadly, undeniably. The journalist has the documents. You need to get to the journalist. Tell the story." "Go," Dominic said, simply, completely. Marco went. And then the front entrance, doors opening, Carver's team entering, boots on the old floor. Dominic Cross stood in the middle of the main hall, alone, with his hands visible and his expression exactly as it always was, composed, clear, giving nothing away. Carver entered. The two men looked at each other. "Where is the Second Heir?" Carver said. "Gone," Dominic said. "The Covenant copy. Witnessed, submitted. Article 7 has been invoked." Silence. "You understand what you've done," Carver said. "I understand exactly what I've done," Dominic said. "Do you?" "I've undone 30 years of." "You've attempted to undo something that was always going to surface," Dominic said, with the patient precision of someone who has been waiting 11 years to say this. "The Covenant doesn't disappear because you want it to. The bloodlines don't cease to exist because you remove the people carrying them. You built a structure on a foundation you couldn't actually destroy, and you spent 20 years calling it stability." He looked at Carver directly. "You killed Marcus Vossen," Dominic said. "Not accusation, statement. Precise. Documented. You killed his family, his cousins, his brother. You manufactured charges against the Brennan heir. You have spent 8 years running an internal suppression apparatus that violated the founding covenant in 23 specific ways, all of which are now part of the Article 7 evidence record." Carver was very still. "The Leadership Council's authority is suspended pending elders' review," Dominic continued. "That process begins with the publication of the documentation, which is happening now, through channels that neither you nor anyone on the council controls. It's done, Carver. The question now is what you do with that." "You'll be detained," Carver said, flat. "Yes," Dominic agreed. "I expected that. The council will challenge the invocation. They'll try. The documentation is robust, and the journalist who now has it is very good at her job." "Why?" Carver said, and for the first time something genuinely unguarded moved across his face, something that might, in a different context, have been curiosity. "You had everything. Position, authority, 11 years of." "I had a position in an organization that had stopped being what it was supposed to be," Dominic said. "And I had a father who told me that mattered. You made a different choice. I'm not surprised, but you should know that the choice you made was always going to arrive here." "You're going to regret this," Carver said. Dominic Cross looked at him. Something moved in his eyes, not regret, not fear, something that takes a moment to identify. "Certainty." "No," he said simply, "I don't think I am." Meanwhile, the city. Marco moved through streets with purpose and direction, the Covenant's path already secured, his destination clear. The journalist's name was Renee Holt. She had spent 15 years covering institutional corruption, the slow, patient, methodical kind of journalism that doesn't generate headlines quickly, but that builds cases so airtight that they survive every legal challenge thrown at them. She had received the documentation 20 minutes ago. She was already working. Marco reached her location, a private office in a building she used for exactly this kind of situation, in 40 minutes. She looked up when he entered. Looked at him, at the evidence of recent violence, at the steadiness in his eyes, for a moment. "You're Marco Voss," she said. "Yes." "The last surviving Vossen heir." "Yes." "And you want to tell me the story?" "I want you to tell the story," he said. "You have the documents. I'm the verification." She looked at him for a moment longer, then, "Sit down," she said. "Start from the beginning." And Marco Voss, who had started this entire chain of events dying in a rain-soaked alley, who had spent 5 years loyal to the people who murdered his father, who had spent 4 days learning who he really was and deciding what to do about it, sat down and started from the beginning. The second betrayal. The story broke 48 hours later. Not on the front page of a newspaper, those days were largely over. It broke online, in Renee Holt's platform, with the kind of methodical, comprehensive documentation that made it impossible to dismiss as speculation or conspiracy. The founding covenant, the Article 7 invocation, the authenticated identity of Marco Voss as the last surviving Vossan heir, the governance failure evidence, 20 years of internal syndicate records showing the systematic elimination of founding family members, Carver's personal operational records extracted from the archive, financial documentation, communications, names. The story created the kind of reaction that only happens when something that many people have suspected for a long time is finally, irrefutably confirmed. In the legitimate world, in politics, in law enforcement, in the press, it triggered investigations that had been stalled for years suddenly becoming possible. The manufactured charges against the imprisoned heir were examined. His release, pending a full review, was ordered within 72 hours. In the underworld, in the Syndicate's own internal geography, the reaction was more complex, more fractured. The Leadership Council had lost its authority. Formally, legally, within the Syndicate's own founding law, it was suspended. The Elders' Council was being assembled. The review process was beginning. And in that vacuum of authority, in the space where certainty had existed and now didn't, people were choosing sides. Some of the Syndicate's operational divisions announced, through their own internal channels, that they would respect the Article 7 process. These were mostly the divisions that had chafed under the current leadership's consolidation of power, the ones that had been squeezed, managed too tightly, stripped of operational independence. Others aligned with the Leadership Council in challenging the invocation. They hired lawyers, expensive ones, the kind who specialized in making inconvenient truths disappear through procedural complexity. They attacked the documentation's authenticity. They questioned the witnesses. They began, with considerable resources and determination, to construct the legal machinery of suppression. And some, the most dangerous kind, began looking for Marco Voss. Not with official orders, with private ones. 3 separate units, Sierra reported. 2 of them are council-aligned enforcement. The third one is more complicated. Complicated how? The third unit doesn't appear to be working for the council, she said. They're using different communication protocols, different vehicles. They have access to our location data that should have been clean. Someone in our network, Marco said. Yes. The word sat in the room. In the underworld, betrayal is not an exception. It is a climate. It is the weather that everything operates in, the background condition against which all trust is provisional and all loyalty is tested continuously. Marco had known this, had lived in it for 5 years, had thought he had a reasonable understanding of how it operated. But knowing a thing intellectually and encountering it personally, encountering it in the specific form of someone who had been, apparently, on their side, feeding their location to people who wanted them dead, were different experiences. Who, he asked. Sierra set a photograph on the table. Marco looked at it. The person in the photograph was someone he recognized, not from the Syndicate, from Dominic Cross's inner circle, one of the few people Dominic had trusted with full operational knowledge. A man named Rail, who had been apparently a plant. Not from the Syndicate's Leadership Council. That would have been, in a terrible way, straightforward. A known enemy playing a known game. No. Rail was working for a third party. Who does he work for? Marco asked. There's a faction, Sierra said carefully, outside the Syndicate structure. They've been watching the Article 7 situation develop, watching from a distance, preparing for the outcome. If the Leadership Council is suspended and the invocation proceeds to its conclusion, the power vacuum that results is exploitable. Significantly. They want to use the restructuring to insert their own people, Marco said. Let us do the hard work of removing the current leadership, then move into the space we've created. Yes, Sierra said, and Rail has been their intelligence source throughout. How much do they know? Everything we've done in the past 4 days, every location, the identity of our witnesses, Renat Holt's involvement, the evidence package, the location where Dominic is being held. The implications of that last item landing like a physical blow. Marco stood quickly. "We need to move," he said. "Marco, we need to get to Dominic before they do," he said. "If that faction gets to him first." "They're not interested in killing him," Sierra said. "They're interested in leverage. A man with Dominic Cross's knowledge and network is worth considerably more alive." "That's not better," Marco said. "That's different. Dominic in their hands is the same as Dominic working against us. They'll use him to redirect the invocation process, to control the Elders' Council selection, to engineer exactly the outcome the Founding Covenant was designed to prevent. Consolidated power, different hands." "Can we get into the facility?" Marco asked. "Dominic designed the security protocols for that facility too," Sierra said, "which means he left himself a way in." "He leaves himself a way in everywhere," Sierra confirmed. "The question is whether I have the specific access he built for this particular location." "Do you?" "He told me," she said slowly, "that if he was ever in a position where he needed extraction from an internal facility and couldn't request it himself, I should look in the second drawer of his desk in the library." "Did you look?" "When we evacuated the building, yes." She reached into her bag, placed a small envelope on the table. Marco looked at it. "That's either the key," he said, "or a very expensive lesson in misplaced trust." "Yes," Sierra agreed, "one of those two things." This is the moment in the story where a lesser narrative would give you a clean choice, a clear right path and a clear wrong path, a hero who knows exactly what to do. This story doesn't do that. Because what Marco was sitting with in that room, with a faction he didn't know moving on the man who had saved his life, with an invocation that was real and fragile and under attack from multiple directions simultaneously, with a father's letter in his pocket and a crest on his chest, and 5 years of false loyalty behind him, and an entirely uncertain future ahead, was not a clear choice. It was a genuine dilemma. He could stay, continue building the legal and public case for the invocation, let Dominic's detention run its course. The legal situation was, ultimately, untenable for Carver's people, and time was working in their favor. Risk losing Dominic to the third faction, but avoid direct confrontation with Carver's team in a holding facility. Or he could go, attempt the extraction, put the invocation documentation at risk if something went wrong, trade the legal high ground for the operational need. He sat with it. He thought about his father's letter. Avasan carries what they are given. He thought about Dominic Cross standing in the main hall telling him to go, the certainty in his eyes. He thought about what it meant to owe someone a debt, a real one, the kind that wasn't transactional, the kind that existed because someone had made a choice in a rain-soaked alley, and that choice had given him everything that followed. He picked up the envelope. "Tell me about the facility," he said. "The mark that cannot be erased." The facility was a repurposed warehouse in the industrial district, not far, as geography went, from the alley where this story had begun. Marco found that fitting. The envelope had contained what Sierra described as a skeleton credential, a master access code that Dominic had embedded in the facility's security system when he designed it, accessible via a specific sequence that bypassed the standard authentication entirely. A back door, built into the architecture by the architect, known only to him and now to the two people he'd chosen to share it with. It was, Marco reflected, very like Dominic Cross, not a dramatic gesture, not a contingency born of paranoia, simply the careful, methodical practice of a man who understood that even the most secure position could become a trap, and who had, as was his habit, prepared. The external security was Carver's people, 6 of them, posted at entrances, running the kind of perimeter watch that assumed the threat was external. They were not wrong, technically, but they were watching the wrong perimeter. Marco used the credential at the maintenance access panel. The door opened. Inside, the particular silence of a building that has been converted from industrial use to something else. The echo of large spaces, the hum of systems, the absence of the sounds that warehouses usually have. He moved through it using the building's architectural logic. Dominic had, in addition to designing the security system, provided Sierra with a floor plan that turned out to have been drawn from memory, which said something about the kind of memory Dominic Cross possessed. He found him. Dominic Cross was seated at a table, unrestrained, because Carver's people, whatever else they were, understood that restraining Dominic Cross was both unnecessary and would create documentation problems if this situation was ever reviewed. With the composure of a man who has decided that the room he's in is not going to be allowed to define his state of mind. He looked up when Marco entered. "I wondered," Dominic said, "whether you'd come." "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I thought there were good arguments for not coming. The invocation is proceeding," Marco said. "Renat Holt's platform has been running the story for 36 hours. 3 news outlets have picked it up. The Elders' Council Assembly has been formally requested by 2 of the division heads who have broken from the Leadership Council. Your detention is legally untenable. If we'd waited, they would have had to release you." "If we'd waited," Dominic said, "we would have run into a specific problem." "You know about the third faction," Marco said. "I've known about them for 6 months," Dominic said. "I was waiting to confirm the identity of their internal contact before acting." "Rail." "Yes." "How much does he know?" "Everything," Marco said, "including this location." Something shifted in Dominic's eyes, not alarm, recalculation. "Then we have less time than ideal," he said. "We have approximately 40 minutes before their unit arrives," Marco confirmed, "which is why we need to move now." Dominic stood, the movement of a man whose body has had approximately 36 hours of forced rest and is not unhappy about the prospect of using it again. "There's a second thing," Marco said, as they moved toward the door. Dominic looked at him. "The invocation is complete and the story is public," Marco said. "But the Elders' Council selection is where this is going to be won or lost. If the third faction controls even 2 seats on that council." "They control the review process," Dominic said. "Yes, I know. We need the selection to happen before they can position their people. Which means we need to be present at the formal notification process," Dominic said. "The Elders' Council notification is triggered by the lead witness's formal request. The retired judge who witnessed the invocation is the lead witness." "I know where he is," Marco said. "Of course you do," Dominic said, something in his voice dry, quiet, almost warm. "Let's go." They moved through the facility, the credential used again at the maintenance exit. The city, night. Rain returning the third time, softer now, less apocalyptic, more like the city cleaning itself. They moved through it. And here is the thing about what happened in the hours that followed, the things that deserve to be in the record, that need to be understood clearly. It was not clean. The third faction's unit arrived at the facility 4 minutes after Dominic and Marco had left, so close that Sierra, monitoring from outside, could see both groups in the same frame of her surveillance feed. 4 minutes. The Elders' Council notification was contested. 3 lawyers from the Leadership Council's retained firm appeared at the judge's residence and attempted, through procedural challenge, to delay the formal request. The challenge failed because the judge had spent 40 years understanding the difference between legitimate procedural concerns and delay tactics deployed in bad faith, and he was not a man who could be intimidated by lawyers. Rail was identified and confronted. He chose, in the end, to cooperate not from conscience, but from the same cold calculation that governed everyone in this world. The side he'd been working for was losing, the documentation against him was comprehensive, and cooperation offered the only viable path forward. Through Rail, they learned the full extent of the third faction's plans, who they were, what they'd intended, what resources they'd positioned for the invocation's aftermath. That information became part of the record too. The Elders' Council was formally assembled 12 days after the invocation. 7 members, representatives of the organizational traditions that had predated the current leadership's consolidation, people who had survived the past 20 years by staying below the level of the Leadership Council's paranoia while quietly maintaining the principles that the council had abandoned. Marco was present. Dominic was present, no longer detained, his legal status clarified by the Elders' Council's first formal act, which was to declare the Leadership Council's detention orders null and void. Carver was present as a witness, under the kind of formal compulsion that the Covenant provided for. The room was old, serious, the weight of history palpable in it. The review proceedings took 11 days. We won't detail all of them, but we'll note the moments that mattered. The moment when the governance failure evidence was formally entered into the record, all 23 specific violations, each one documented with the precision that Dominic Cross had spent 11 years assembling. The moment when Carver, facing the weight of that documentation and the council's questioning, stopped denying what had been done. Not confessing, he was too careful for confession, but no longer denying. The moment when the imprisoned heir, released, as ordered, pending review, joined the proceedings via video link, and formally corroborated the Brennan lineage documentation. And the moment, the one that Marco would remember differently from all the others, the one that felt less like an event and more like the world shifting on its axis. When the Elders' Council delivered its finding. The Leadership Council's authority was not merely suspended, it was formally revoked, a finding of catastrophic governance failure, as defined by Article 7, that stripped the current council of its standing within the organization's founding law. New governance protocols were ordered, a transitional council with oversight from the elders to manage the organization's operations while permanent governance structures were established. The people responsible for the Vossen family's elimination, named, documented on record, were referred for formal accountability proceedings within the organization's own justice mechanisms. It was not the clean, immediate consequence that revenge fantasies promise, but it was real, it was documented, it was binding. And it could not be undone. Marco sat with the letter in his pocket, his father's letter, the one that had been waiting 21 years for him to be ready to read it, and thought about what it meant. Not triumph, not closure. Closure was a word that belonged to a different kind of story, and he had learned in the past 2 weeks to be precise about what kind of story he was actually living. Something more honest than triumph. Accountability. The word the lawyer had used. He looked across the room at Dominic Cross, who was watching the proceedings with the expression of a man who has reached the destination of an 11-year journey and is already, characteristically, thinking about what comes next. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Not words, just the acknowledgement between two people who have been through something genuine together of what it cost and what it produced and whether the accounting balances. What comes after the rain? 3 months after the night in the alley. Marco and Dominic Cross sat in a restaurant in the old district. One of Dominic's, as it happened, though it was the kind of restaurant that looked exactly like everyone else's restaurant, which was, characteristically, the point. They were having the conversation that had been waiting, through all the urgency and crisis and procedural complexity of the past months, to be had. The Transitional Council wants you on it, Dominic said. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without preamble, giving it exactly as much weight as it had and no more. Marco looked at him, me. You're the Vossen heir. You have standing that no one else in the room has, and you understand the organization from the inside, field operations, not leadership theory. You know what it looks like from the ground. And you, Marco asked. Advisory position, Dominic said. I have no interest in a formal governance role. I never have. I am much better as the person who knows where everything is. The third faction, Marco said. They didn't disappear. No, Dominic agreed. They regrouped. Their leadership changed. Rail's cooperation cost them their primary intelligence asset, which means they're rebuilding from a position of reduced information. They're also facing the realization that the invocation's outcome wasn't the power vacuum they planned for. They'll adapt. They always do. Which means the work isn't finished, Dominic said. It was never going to be finished in 3 months or a year. The invocation was the beginning of a process, not the end of one. But the beginning is done. That matters. Marco nodded slowly, looked out the window at the city, the real one, the visible one, the one that most people see. I've been thinking about my father, he said. Dominic waited, listened. He spent the last years of his life building protections, hiding, writing letters for a future he didn't know would come, and part of me is anger.